Picture this: a charity gala in the grand ballroom of the most exclusive hotel in San Francisco. 300 of the richest people in the state, dressed in silk and diamonds, sipping champagne under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. And in the middle of that room, a maid, a nobody in a black and white uniform, reached out, grabbed the billionaire's fiancée by the back of her designer gown, and yanked her backwards so hard the woman stumbled off her heels and hit the marble floor in front of every single guest. The room went dead silent. 300 jaws dropped. 300 phones came out. The fiancée's champagne glass shattered at her feet, and she looked up from the floor with mascara already running, screaming one sentence that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "She's nobody. She's just a maid." But the maid wasn't looking at her anymore. She was looking at the billionaire, holding a phone screen toward his face, and what was on that screen made a grown man worth $4 billion go completely white. What was on that phone? I'll get there. But first, you need to understand how a quiet, invisible woman from a tiny town in Georgia ended up standing in the most powerful room in San Francisco, tearing apart a lie that had been building for over a year. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad you found this channel. Hit that subscribe button, tap the like, and drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now, it all started 19 months earlier, on a hot August morning, when a 27-year-old woman named Grace Holloway stepped off a Greyhound bus in downtown San Francisco with $86 in her pocket and a job offer she still wasn't sure was real. Grace had grown up in Alma, Georgia. Population just under 4,000. A place where everybody knew everybody, where Friday nights meant high school football, and where opportunities were something you heard about on television, not something that showed up at your front door. She had been raised by her grandmother, Loretta, after her mother left when Grace was 6 and never came back. Her father was a name on a birth certificate she had never met. Loretta worked as a seamstress out of her living room until her arthritis got so bad she couldn't hold a needle straight anymore. Grace dropped out of community college at 19 to take care of her. She worked at the only diner in town, 6 days a week, until the owner sold it and she found herself unemployed with no savings, no degree, and no plan. The job listing had appeared on her phone like some kind of joke. Live in housekeeper needed for private residence in San Francisco. Full room and board provided. Salary upon inquiry. Discretion and reliability required. No experience necessary. Grace almost scrolled past it. But $86 doesn't leave room for pride, and Loretta's medication wasn't going to pay for itself. She applied at 2 in the morning from the floor of her grandmother's living room, typing on a phone with a cracked screen, not expecting to hear back. 3 days later, a woman named Mrs. Paxton called her. Sharp voice, precise words. No warmth, but no cruelty either. "The position is with the household of Mr. Julian Thorne," Mrs. Paxton said. "You will live on the property. Your duties will include housekeeping, event preparation, laundry, and general household maintenance. Mr. Thorne values privacy above all else. If you cannot be invisible, this is not the job for you." Grace didn't hesitate. "I've been invisible my whole life, ma'am. I'm good at it." She got the job. Julian Thorne was 36 years old. The sole heir to a tech and venture capital empire his father had built from a garage in Palo Alto in the early 90s. When his father died of a stroke 5 years earlier, Julian inherited everything. The company, the properties, the board seats, and a net worth that financial magazines loved to argue about. But Julian wasn't what the magazines made him look like. The first time Grace saw him, he was sitting on the back patio of his Pacific Heights mansion at 5:30 in the morning, barefoot in sweatpants, drinking black coffee and watching the fog roll in over the bay. He looked up when she stepped outside with a broom and smiled like she was a friend, not an employee. "You must be Grace," he said warmly. "Mrs. Paxton tells me you came all the way from Georgia. That's a long way from home. I hope this place feels like one eventually." Over the following weeks, Grace learned that Julian Thorne was nothing like the billionaires she had imagined from television. He drove himself to work. He cooked his own breakfast on weekends. He knew the name of every person on his household staff, asked about their families, and once quietly paid the emergency room bill for his gardener's daughter without telling a soul. Grace respected him deeply. She kept her head down, did her work, and sent every paycheck home to Loretta in Alma. She called her grandmother every Sunday night without fail, no matter how tired she was. Then, 5 months into Grace's employment, Julian brought someone home. Her name was Serena Cross, and the moment she walked through that front door, something in the air of that house changed forever. Serena Cross was 31 years old. Tall, stunning, with the kind of beauty that didn't just enter a room but rearranged it. Every head turned. Every conversation paused. She moved like she had been trained to be watched, and she had perfected the art of making it look effortless. She told everyone she was from old money in Newport Beach. She had a degree in architecture from a prestigious university, a smile that could disarm anyone in seconds, and a laugh that made Julian look at her like she had invented sunlight. Julian had fallen for her fast. Too fast. The kind of fast that made Grace uncomfortable, though she told herself it wasn't her place to have opinions about her employer's love life. Serena moved into the mansion within 2 months of their first date. And that was when Grace started noticing things. It began small. Moments most people would have missed, but Grace wasn't most people. She had spent her entire life watching, reading rooms, studying faces, learning how to survive by understanding what people really meant underneath the words they chose to say. The first thing she noticed was Serena's voice. Around Julian, it was honey, warm, soft, adoring. But one afternoon, when Julian was at the office and Serena thought she was alone in the kitchen, Grace heard her on the phone from the hallway. "He's not smart, he's just rich," Serena said flatly, her voice stripped of every ounce of warmth Grace had ever heard from her. "There's a difference. Trust me, this won't take long." She laughed. Cold, sharp, nothing like the musical laugh she performed for Julian every evening over dinner. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, dust cloth in her hand, heart beating faster than it should have been. The second thing she noticed was Serena's treatment of the staff. When Julian was home, Serena was gracious. She said please and thank you. She complimented the meals. She smiled at everyone. When Julian left for work, the mask came off like a coat. "Is this how you fold towels?" Serena had snapped at Grace one Tuesday morning, holding up a perfectly folded bath towel like it was evidence of a crime. "My dog could do better than this. Do it again." All of them. Grace redid every towel in the house without a word. When Julian came home that evening, Serena kissed him at the door and said, "Grace is such a treasure. We're so lucky to have her." Grace said nothing. She smiled politely and went back to the laundry room. But she stopped trusting Serena Cross from that moment forward. And she started paying very close attention to every single thing the woman did when she thought nobody was watching. 3 months later, Grace heard something that made her legs nearly give out beneath her. It was a Wednesday evening. Julian had flown to New York for a week-long series of investor meetings. The mansion was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home for the night. Grace was in the wine cellar beneath the kitchen, restocking bottles for an upcoming dinner party, when she heard footsteps above her on the hardwood floor. Then Serena's voice, clear, sharp, echoing down through the vent that connected the cellar to the kitchen above. She was on a phone call, and she clearly believed she was completely alone in the house. "I told you, the prenup is bulletproof," Serena said, her tone cold and clinical in a way that made Grace's skin crawl. "His lawyers drafted it themselves. If I divorce him, I get nothing. A settlement, maybe, if I'm lucky. That's not why I'm here. That was never why I'm here." Grace stopped moving. Her hand froze on a wine bottle halfway to the rack. She pressed her back against the stone wall of the cellar and held her breath. "After the wedding," Serena continued, calm and controlled, almost bored with the words coming out of her own mouth. "After the life insurance is locked in and the beneficiary paperwork clears, we wait. 7 months, maybe 8. Something slow. Something that builds gradually and looks completely natural by the time anyone thinks to ask questions." Grace's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the wine rack to stop herself from hitting the floor. "His father died of a heart attack at 62, Serena said, softer now, almost amused. Bad hearts run in the family. Nobody is going to look twice when the son has the same problem a little ahead of schedule. The payout is clean. No divorce lawyers. No custody fights. No splitting assets. Just a grieving widow who inherits everything, mourns for a respectable amount of time, and then disappears. We've discussed this. Stop calling me on this phone unless it's absolutely necessary. The call ended. Heels clicked across the hardwood above, fading down the hallway toward the master suite. A door closed somewhere in the distance. Grace stood in that wine cellar for what felt like forever. Her hands were shaking so badly, the bottle she was holding clinked against the rack. Her heart was pounding in her ears. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. She replayed every word. Something slow. Something that looks completely natural. A grieving widow who inherits everything. This wasn't a maid overthinking a strange phone call. This wasn't suspicion or jealousy or imagination. This was a woman calmly, precisely, methodically planning to murder the man who trusted her with his entire life. And Grace Holloway, the invisible nobody from Alma, Georgia, was the only person alive who knew about it. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room at the back of the mansion, staring at the ceiling, replaying Serena's voice over and over in her head, like a recording she couldn't turn off. Something slow. Something that looks completely natural. A grieving widow who inherits everything. She thought about calling the police. She picked up her phone 3 times and put it down 3 times. Because what would she say? That she overheard a phone call through a vent in a wine cellar? No recording. No name of the person on the other end. No proof of anything except the word of a 27-year-old housekeeper from a town nobody in San Francisco had ever heard of, against the word of a woman who had charmed every person in Julian Thorne's world without a single crack in the performance. She thought about telling Julian directly, sitting him down when he got back from New York, looking him in the eyes and saying, "The woman you're about to marry is planning to kill you. I heard her say it." And then what? Serena would cry. Serena would deny everything. Serena would call Grace jealous, obsessed, mentally unstable. She would say the maid had developed feelings for Julian and was fabricating accusations to destroy their relationship. Julian's friends would believe Serena. His lawyers would believe Serena. His board members would believe Serena. And Grace would be fired, escorted off the property, and blacklisted from every domestic position in the state before the weekend. Serena had money. Serena had connections. Serena had a face and a voice that made powerful people want to protect her. Grace had nothing. No lawyer. No powerful friends. No safety net. She had a grandmother back in Georgia whose medication cost $400 a month, and a life that was held together entirely by this one job she could not afford to lose. She sat up in bed and walked to the small window of her room. San Francisco glittered beneath the fog, the Golden Gate Bridge barely visible in the distance. Red towers fading in and out of the mist like something from a dream. Somewhere in this house, a good man was going to come home from New York in 5 days, kiss the woman he loved, and have no idea that she was already counting down the months until he stopped breathing. Grace pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She could stay quiet. She could keep folding towels and polishing silver and pretend she never heard that phone call. She could protect herself, protect Loretta, protect the fragile life she had built from nothing. Or she could risk everything for a man who had never once treated her like she was nobody. By the time the fog burned off the next morning and sunlight hit the bay, Grace had made her decision. She wasn't going to stay silent, but she wasn't going to be stupid about it either. Grace understood one thing with absolute clarity. Suspicion without proof was a death sentence for her credibility. If she was going to do this, she needed evidence so undeniable that no lawyer, no charm, no amount of Serena's tears could make it disappear. And she needed to collect it without Serena ever suspecting that the quiet maid folding her towels was watching her every single move. So Grace became 2 people. On the outside, she was the same invisible housekeeper who arrived early, worked hard, and never spoke unless spoken to. On the inside, she was cataloging everything. The first opportunity came 4 weeks after the phone call. Julian was at the office. Serena had left for a yoga class in Pacific Heights. Grace was cleaning the master bathroom when she noticed Serena's small clutch sitting on the marble countertop beside the sink. The one she carried when she wanted to travel light. The one she never left behind. Grace's hands were trembling before she even touched the zipper. She knew that if Serena walked back through that door in this moment, there would be no explanation on earth that could save her. But she unzipped it anyway. Inside, tucked beneath a compact mirror and a tube of lipstick, she found two things. A pharmacy receipt from a drugstore in Oakland. Not San Francisco. Not anywhere near Pacific Heights or the mansion. A store Serena had clearly driven 45 minutes out of her way to visit. The item on the receipt was listed only as a prescription code. Nothing Grace could identify on her own. The second item was a plain white business card. No logo, no clinic name. Just a name printed in small black letters. Dr. Vincent Marsh. A phone number. And an address in Daly City. Grace photographed both items with hands that would not stop shaking. She placed everything back exactly as she found it, zipped the clutch closed, and walked out of that bathroom on legs that barely held her weight. That night, locked in her small room, Grace searched the name on her phone. What she found made her stomach drop. Dr. Vincent Marsh had lost his medical license in Nevada 4 years earlier after an investigation into the sudden cardiac death of a wealthy private patient. He was never formally charged, but the case had generated enough suspicion to permanently end his legitimate career. He had relocated to the Bay Area, changed his practice entirely, and now operated a private consultation service for clients who paid large fees and never asked for receipts. Grace sat on her bed staring at that screen, connecting the pieces one by one. A disgraced doctor with a history linked to unexplained cardiac death. A pharmacy receipt from a store 45 minutes away. And a fiancé who had already spoken out loud about making Julian's death look like it happened on its own. The pieces fit. But Grace knew that photographs of a receipt and a business card weren't proof of murder. Any decent lawyer would tear it apart in minutes. She needed something physical, something undeniable, and she had a terrible, sinking feeling she already knew exactly where to find it. Grace found it 6 weeks before the wedding, on a Sunday morning in April when the fog was so thick the mansion felt like it was floating in a cloud. Serena had gone to brunch in Napa with 2 friends. Julian was at a charity board meeting downtown. The house was completely empty except for Grace, who was supposed to be vacuuming the guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor. Instead, she walked into Serena's private dressing room and closed the door behind her. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her own ears. She moved slowly, carefully, checking every drawer, every shelf, every compartment of every handbag lined up on the custom-built shelving unit along the far wall. She lifted folded sweaters. She opened jewelry boxes. She ran her fingers along the back edges of every shelf, searching for something hidden, something that didn't belong. Took her almost 30 minutes to find it. Tucked inside the satin lining of an old evening clutch on the highest shelf, wrapped in a single piece of tissue paper, was a small unmarked glass vial. Clear liquid inside. No label. No prescription sticker. No markings of any kind. Grace held it up toward the window, the pale foggy light filtering through the glass and illuminating the liquid inside. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She photographed it from every angle. She documented exactly which shelf, which clutch, exactly how the tissue paper had been folded. Then she placed it back precisely as she had found it and left the room without making a sound. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small desk in her room, staring at the photographs on her cracked phone screen, knowing in her gut what that vial was but understanding that her gut meant nothing in a courtroom. She needed science. She needed a lab. She needed something that would survive the army of lawyers Serena would unleash the moment she was accused. Grace spent the next 2 weeks researching quietly. She found a private toxicology laboratory in Sacramento that offered confidential testing for individuals with safety concerns. The rush analysis cost $900. Almost every dollar Grace had saved over the past 4 months. She waited for her window. It came 5 days before the wedding, when Serena left for a final fitting at a bridal boutique in Union Square. Grace moved fast. She extracted the smallest possible amount from the vial using a plastic dropper she had bought for exactly this purpose, sealed the sample in a sterile bag, replaced the vial in its hiding place, and drove to Sacramento that same afternoon. 2 days later, 3 days before the wedding, the results arrived in her email. The substance was a slow-acting cardiac glycoside, undetectable in a standard autopsy, designed to mimic natural heart failure when administered in small repeated doses over a period of weeks. Grace read that report sitting in her parked car outside a gas station in Vacaville, hands gripping the steering wheel, tears streaming silently down her face. Not tears of fear, tears of grief. Because now she knew with absolute scientific certainty that the man who had looked at her on her very first day and said, "I hope this place feels like home," was going to be murdered by the woman he slept beside every single night. Grace wiped her face, folded the lab report, put it in her jacket pocket, and drove back to San Francisco in silence. She had the proof. Now she needed the moment. The charity gala was Serena's idea. A black tie event at the Grand Monarch Hotel in downtown San Francisco. 300 of the city's most powerful people gathered in one ballroom to celebrate Julian's foundation for underprivileged youth. It was scheduled for 10 days before the wedding. The final public event before Julian Thorne officially became a married man. Grace had spent the entire week helping coordinate logistics, flower arrangements, seating charts, table settings. She moved through the mansion carrying checklists and garment bags, her hands steady, her face calm, the folded lab report tucked inside the inner pocket of her uniform like a grenade with the pin still in. She had rehearsed 100 versions of how this could go. 100 different moments where she could pull Julian aside quietly, hand him the evidence, let security handle it, let it happen far away from cameras and crowds and champagne. But on the morning of the gala, standing alone in the service corridor of the mansion, Grace froze. She thought about Loretta, 81 years old, sitting in that small house in Alma, Georgia, waiting for Grace's next paycheck to cover the medication that kept her blood pressure stable. She thought about what would happen to her grandmother if Grace lost this job tonight. If she stood up in front of 300 strangers and accused a woman like Serena Cross and nobody believed her. She almost put the lab report back in her room. Almost told herself she had done enough. Almost convinced herself that she could mail the evidence anonymously and let someone else take the risk. And then she saw Julian. He was standing in the foyer, alone for just a moment, adjusting his cufflinks in front of the hallway mirror. He was wearing a navy blue tuxedo, and he looked nervous in the way good men get nervous before events they care about, not nervous about being seen, but nervous about whether the night would actually help the kids his foundation was built to serve. He caught Grace's reflection in the mirror and turned around with that familiar warm smile. "Grace, you've been incredible this week," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I mean it. None of this happens without you. I don't say it enough, but I see how hard you work, and I'm grateful. Truly." He meant every word. She could hear it in his voice. The same kindness, the same decency he had shown her from the very first morning she arrived at this house 19 months ago. And in that moment, standing in that hallway with the lab report pressing against her ribs, Grace understood something with a clarity that nearly broke her in half. If she stayed silent tonight, Julian Thorne would be dead before Christmas. And she would spend the rest of her life knowing she could have stopped it and chose not to because she was afraid. Grace looked him in the eyes, smiled softly, and said, "You're welcome, Mr. Thorne. It's going to be a good night." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her jaw set, her decision final. Tonight, 300 people were going to learn the truth, whether they wanted to hear it or not. The gala was magnificent. For 4 hours, Grace worked the edges of the ballroom, carrying trays of champagne, clearing plates, adjusting centerpieces, invisible to every single person in that room, the way she had been invisible her entire life. Serena was breathtaking. She glided through the crowd in a floor-length emerald green gown, diamonds at her throat, her hand resting on Julian's arm like she owned him. She laughed with donors. She charmed board members. She kissed Julian on the cheek for the photographer and whispered something in his ear that made him smile like a man who believed he had found the love of his life. Grace watched it all from the shadows, the lab report in her pocket, her phone in her hand, The photographs of every piece of evidence she had collected over the past 6 months loaded and ready. She waited for her moment. It came at 9:47 p.m. Julian stepped up to the podium to deliver his closing remarks. 300 guests turned their chairs to face him. Serena stood beside him, glowing, her hand resting on his back, playing the role of devoted partner with flawless precision. Julian raised his glass. To everyone in this room tonight, thank you. And to the woman standing beside me, who has made me believe that the best chapter of my life is still ahead of me. 300 glasses rose into the air, and Grace stepped forward from the service entrance, walked straight through the center of the ballroom, and stopped 5 feet from the podium. Before anyone drinks to that, Grace said, her voice carrying across the silent room with a steadiness that surprised even her. There is something every person in this room needs to see. Julian lowered his glass, confused. Serena's smile flickered for half a second, a crack so small only someone who had spent months studying her face would have caught it. This woman is not who she says she is, Grace continued, holding up her phone screen toward Julian. I have lab results confirming a cardiac toxin I found hidden in her dressing room. I have photographs. I have a connection to a doctor who lost his license after a patient died the same way she is planning to kill you. I have been documenting this for 6 months. The room went completely silent. 300 faces frozen. 300 champagne glasses suspended in mid-air. Serena moved first. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh and turned to Julian with wide, wounded eyes. Julian, this is ridiculous, she said, her voice cracking with perfectly rehearsed disbelief. She's nobody. She's just a maid. She's clearly obsessed with you. This is some kind of pathetic revenge fantasy because I told Mrs. Paxton to let her go last month. That's a lie, Grace said quietly. And you know it. Something behind Serena's eyes shifted. The performance collapsed. Panic replaced composure. She lunged across the space between them, grabbed Grace by the wrist, and tried to snatch the phone from her hand. Grace didn't let go. She planted her feet on the marble floor, pulled her arm back, and with her free hand reached out and grabbed the back of Serena's emerald gown so hard the fabric stretched, and the seam at the shoulder tore with a sound that echoed through the ballroom. Serena stumbled backward, nearly falling, her dress ripped, her composure shattered in front of 300 of the most powerful people in San Francisco. Grace held the phone screen up toward Julian one final time and said 4 words that ended everything. Look at your phone. Now. Grace had sent everything to Julian's phone 15 minutes before she stepped forward. The lab report, the photographs of the vial, the pharmacy receipt from Oakland, the business card of Dr. Vincent Marsh, the printed records of Marsh's license revocation, and 6 months of dated journal entries documenting every phone call, every suspicious errand, every lie she had witnessed Serena tell. Julian pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. The room was so quiet you could hear his thumb unlock the screen. He read in silence. His face changed with every swipe. First confusion, then disbelief, then something worse than anger, recognition. The slow, devastating understanding of a man who was finally seeing the woman standing beside him for who she truly was. He looked up at Serena. His voice came out barely above a whisper. Is this true? Serena didn't answer the question. She screamed. She lunged at Julian, clawing at his phone, shrieking that it was fabricated, that Grace had planted everything, that this was a conspiracy to destroy their life together. Julian stepped back, held the phone out of her reach, and said 1 word to his security team standing near the ballroom doors. Now. 2 guards moved forward. Serena fought them. She kicked, screamed, knocked a champagne flute off a nearby table. 300 guests sat frozen in their chairs watching a woman disintegrate in real time in front of all of them. Police arrived within 12 minutes. Serena was escorted out of the Grand Monarch Hotel in handcuffs, emerald gown torn at the shoulder, mascara streaked down her face, still screaming denials that nobody in that ballroom believed anymore. A search of her belongings that night recovered the remaining vial exactly where Grace had documented it. Her second phone, hidden in a locked drawer in the master bedroom, contained 9 months of messages between her and Dr. Vincent Marsh discussing dosage, timing, and Julian's life insurance policy, which Serena had quietly increased 4 months into the engagement, listing herself as sole beneficiary. Dr. Marsh was arrested 3 days later at a private airfield outside Sacramento attempting to leave the country. Julian found Grace in the hotel service kitchen 2 hours after the police left. She was sitting alone on a plastic chair, hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she hadn't touched, still in her uniform, the red marks from Serena's grip still visible around her wrist. He sat down across from her, quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he finally asked. Grace looked up at him with eyes that carried 6 months of sleepless nights behind them. "Because I was nobody," she said softly. "And she was everything you believed in. If I told you alone, she would have made it disappear. I needed every person in that room to see it at the same time so nobody could ever bury it." Julian didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand gently over hers. "You're not nobody, Grace. You never were." 3 months later, Julian established a foundation in Grace's name. Not as charity, not as payment, but as something built with purpose. A resource for domestic workers who witness abuse, fraud, or danger inside the homes they work in but have no voice, no power, and no protection to speak up. Grace helped design it herself to make sure it served people exactly like her. Grace Holloway didn't become a billionaire. She didn't marry into the family. She went back to a quiet life, kept sending money home to Loretta in Alma, kept calling her grandmother every Sunday night without fail. But she became something no amount of money could ever buy. A woman who proved that courage doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from a quiet person in a uniform who spent 19 months being invisible, carrying a secret heavy enough to crush most people, and waiting for the one moment when the whole world had no choice but to see what she had seen all along. A reporter once asked her if she was afraid that night, standing in that ballroom, grabbing a billionaire's fiancé by the dress in front of 300 of the most powerful people in San Francisco. Grace thought about it for a moment before answering. "I was terrified," she said honestly, "but I was more afraid of staying quiet. I think the bravest people aren't the ones without fear. They're the ones who are more afraid of what happens if they say nothing than what happens if they speak." If the story moved you tonight, I would love for you to tap that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And if you're new here, hit subscribe because we tell stories like this every single week. Real stories about courage, truth, and the quiet heroes who change everything when it matters most. And if you know someone tonight who needs a reminder that one voice really can make a difference, share this with them. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next one.